last week, the US and Russia had the largest prisoner swap in post-Soviet history, involving 24 individuals. And to provide insight into the implications of this significant event, we are joined in the studio by Thomas Graham. He is a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he previously served as a senior director for Russia on the National Security Council's staff during George W. Bush's administration. He's also the author of the book Getting Russia Right. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Tom.
I'm happy to be with you today.
So, what are the key messages that the West should take away from this significant exchange between the US and Russia?
Well, I mean, the first is that when there is a overlap in interest, that it is possible to reach agreement with the Russians, but it is within a very sort of narrow range of issues. One, in this case, in which Putin himself was personally interested, because he had a personal relationship with one of the individuals that was exchanged on the U.S. side. But I think the larger thing for people to remember is that this prisoner exchange does not really tell us that we're in a different space with the Russians, that we're opening up a possibility for a broader dialogue with the Russians on the range of issues that divide the United States and Russia and the West, with Ukraine at the center of the agenda. That is simply not the case at this point. This was compartmentalized, something that we did often during the Cold War, some of which we've done less since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022.
Well, this situation has stirred up debate about whether it might incentivize foreign adversary to grab Americans for leverage. Do you think this could lead to more overseas Americans being targeted?
The short answer to that is no, but so much of this depends on the individual countries we're talking about and the state of relations, and whether, in fact, there are prisoners in the American system that the other country would like to exchange for. The issue with the Russians was, in fact, a quite complicated one. The negotiations themselves extended over a number of years. There has been, I think, much more intense focus on this since Evan Gershkovich was arrested by the Russians in the spring of 2023. That focused attention. But Paul Whelan has been in prison for a number of years earlier, and there have been some negotiations involving him. And we also had at least one or two prisoner exchanges previously as well. Now, whether the Russians pick up hostages, American hostages, for the specific issue of trading them, that is a very complicated issue. If you look at the case of Evan Gershkovich, part of the problem was that there was no one in the U.S. prison system that the Russians wanted to trade him for. So we had to go through this very complicated diplomatic effort to get the Germans to agree to trade someone with very high value to the Russians, Vadim Krasikov, an FSB assassin who had murdered a Chechen dissident in broad daylight in Berlin a few years back. So did the Russians pick up Gershkovich with the idea that they were going to trade him for someone? I think you can make a story out that they did. But on the other hand, I think the broader issue with Gershkovich was a desire on the Russians to send a message that there were limits to what journalists could do inside Russia on reporting on very sensitive topics that were critical to maintaining the Russian narrative of what was happening in Ukraine, national unity within Russia. And the Wall Street Journal reporter was, in fact, beginning to chip away at that in his reports back to Washington. So he was seen as something of a threat, I would imagine, picked up for that reason, that it wasn't primarily to do a trade, but to send a message to Western journalists operating in Russia.
Would this have any impact on the Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine?
I think almost no impact on that at all. There's no evidence that Russia is prepared to sit down and have serious negotiations with Kiev or Washington about Ukraine. Kiev is clearly not interested in the types of terms that Russia talks about, which is basically capitulation, And Washington itself has made it very clear from the beginning of this conflict that it is not prepared to sit down with Russia to talk about Ukraine without the Ukrainians at the table. So this exchange, while I think it's good news for the United States, it's good news, obviously, for the prisoners that were released, tells us very little about the course of developments in the Ukraine conflict.
Do you have any thoughts on potential pathways to end the conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
Fourth, this is the, if I had the answer to that question, I would be golden, and there were a lot of people who would be interested in hiring me for my whatever services I can offer. Look, I mean, it's a very complicated situation. What strikes me is that this is not simply a matter of a conversation between the Russians and the Ukrainians, the way it's generally framed in the West. The Kremlin sees the conflict in Ukraine as part of a broader conflict that it's having with the West at this point. It believes that the United States is playing the central role in orchestrating whatever campaign they see against Russia. And for that reason, a resolution of the conflict in Ukraine is going to entail some sort of direct conversation between the United States and Russia. Now, that might not be sufficient, but it is an essential element of any negotiation and the conflict. Obviously, there need to be talks between the Ukrainians and the Russians to work out a number of issues that are directly related to the conflict in Ukraine. How you maintain contacts across the line of on the battlefield, prisoner exchanges, and so forth. But without the United States and Russia talking about broader security issues, European security in particular, strategic issues, nuclear issues, I don't think you're going to have a resolution of the Ukraine conflict. So this is another way of saying we need to think of the resolution as not a single negotiation, but a set of interlocking negotiations that touch on the broad range of issues that are dispute between the United States and Russia, between the West more broadly speaking and Russia, and obviously between Ukraine and Russia.
And what kind of change in policy are you foreseeing with a possible new president, in the White House?
Well, we know we're going to have a new president. We just don't know which new president will be at this point. I think it's fair to say that a Harris administration would pursue the Biden administration's policy in broad outlines. That does not necessarily preclude negotiations. A lot will depend on what happens on the battlefield, how attitudes change in Ukraine, how attitudes change in Moscow, and what challenges the United States is facing elsewhere in the world. A Trump administration is harder to predict at this point, in part because Trump himself is unpredictable. He has claimed that he would resolve the conflict in 24 hours. He said if he is elected, that he'll have the conflict resolved before he's inaugurated in January. I tend to think that is not the case, neither 24 hours nor before the inauguration in January. I would imagine that you would see a continuation of the conflict on the ground, an effort by President Trump to reach out to the Russians. But it's not clear that the Russians are going to offer any different terms than they've been offering up to the moment. And that is unacceptable. My sense is to, if not Trump personally, then to many of the people that would be in critical positions in his administration. It would not be acceptable to the Congress. So I think it's very likely to go through, very unlikely to go through.
You've written about possible NATO membership for Ukraine on a model similar to Sweden. So could you elaborate on what you meant by that, or how it would apply to Ukraine, or is that still relevant?
No, I think that's still relevant. But this really wasn't talking about Ukraine as a member of NATO. This is looking back to the Cold War period and the early post-Cold War period, where Sweden was pursuing a policy of neutrality, but it was what we might call armed neutrality. Sweden had a very advanced defense industrial sector. produced many of its own military aircraft. The equipment that it needed to man its military. It had a very capable military, but it combined that with very close security and intelligence cooperation with the United States. This was kept secret during the Cold War, although I have no doubts that the Russians were aware of the outlines of this, if not all the details. And this provided, I think, something of a deterrent against Russian action against Sweden throughout the Cold War. That was amplified and I think reinforced when Sweden joined the EU in the post-Cold War period. There is something of an implicit security guarantee with the EU. The EU provides something along those lines, but it's very difficult for me to imagine an attack against an EU country that doesn't eventually engage the United States in that conflict. And this is particularly true now, given the overlap in EU membership and NATO membership. So when I talk about a Swedish model for Ukraine, what I'm talking about is a Ukraine that begins to modernize and expand its defense industrial sector. People tend to forget that Ukraine was the fourth largest arms exporter before this conflict. So it has these foundations for that type of defense industrial sector, close security cooperation with the United States, accession talks with the EU moving towards EU membership, yet short of actual NATO membership. I think that would provide a sufficient guarantee for Ukraine's security in the years ahead, and something that might be more easier to sell to the Russians or to reconcile the Russians with, because it would not require explicit Ukrainian membership in NATO.
Tom Graham, thank you so much for speaking to us.
You're certainly welcome.